Hello everyone, David here. I guess I'm going through a bit of a phase of checking all my old stuff and making it work again. I rediscovered my original Xbox from the early noughties, and I quite wanted to give it a whirl and play some Sudeki again. But unfortunately, I'd packed it away with this component cable adapter, the Xbox High Definition AV pack, which was the best option at the time since my HD-ready TV back then had component inputs. But nowadays, my TV is limited to just HDMI. So how can I get this working? Fortunately, there are options. It's now possible to find an adapter to plug straight into your OG Xbox and give you HDMI on the other end, like this one from Kaico. This is not a sponsored video, and I bought this with my own money, so I can be brutally honest about it, which is somewhat of a missed opportunity, I suppose, because it's rather good. Now, as you can see, I've already modded my Xbox. I did this back in the day so that I could use the debug BIOS for development. I used it to run unsigned code and make homebrew. It was also handy for granting access to some options like changing the region of the Xbox or showing the safe area, which isn't really a thing anymore in our pixel-perfect world of today. There are some hardware mods that let you replace the proprietary AV output port with HDMI, and that probably gives you the best results overall. It'll be a perfect digital signal straight from the chips, but it does require some careful soldering and disassembly of your equipment, of course. Also, they're still a little expensive, but perhaps worth it if you want the cleanest signal possible. If you don't want to modify the hardware, there are a few options for getting a decent video signal out of it anyway. You could use the component cables if your TV supports it, or use them with a component to HDMI converter like the Retrospective, although they can get quite expensive. Then there are these Direct-to-HDMI options, and these can really vary in price, but the Kaico one sits at a nice review score on Amazon for not too much money, about £35 in the UK. I also have this SCART to HDMI adapter, so technically you could wire it up using the original Xbox AV cable, but this used composite into a SCART adapter, so this was really the worst quality possible. You can improve it a bit by using an RGB SCART cable, but the console didn't even ship with one of those, at least to begin with. I also need this SCART coupler to bridge the cables. It's a bit of an unwieldy contraption, but it does work. I'll be using this for comparison later, but I wouldn't recommend you hook it up to your TV this way. And quickly, I wanted to mention video modes. In PAL regions, Xbox didn't support any of the high-def options or progressive scan at all, so you couldn't even get 480p. Instead, we always got an interlace signal, 576i at best. In my case, my mod lets me change the video region to NTSC easily and enable all the high-def options. But you can do this with a soft mod if you need to. And I recommend it because on any modern TV or monitor, you're going to be better off with a progressive scan signal, and for a few games, the extra resolution of 720p or even 1080i improves things massively. I'll leave a link to what I think is the best soft mod currently available in the description of this video. But it's interesting, it does mean that if you have an unmodded PAL Xbox, this kind of adapter is only useful as a kind of bridge from old hardware to new, in case you need to get to an HDMI output and nothing else will do. The adapter itself feels pretty solid, sturdy, and the brains of it are encased in metal, although it can't be very thick metal because it's also rather light. Both the Xbox plug and the HDMI socket are a good snug fit. It connects just as well as any first-party accessory. Some HDMI adapters like the Pound model required an extra USB plug for power, but this one doesn't. That might cause a bit more of a noisy signal on later Xbox revisions, as I've heard that Microsoft reduced the power output of the AV port in version 1.4 of the Xbox hardware. I've got an earlier revision here, it's 1.0 or 1.1, and I've noticed the odd wobble and phasey line in the video signal, but it's a rare occurrence. This also has an optical audio output, which I can't test here, but I expect it would be the same as the one on the component cables breakout box, and that was good. So it doesn't do any upscaling. It won't send a native 1080p signal to your TV, it just outputs whatever the Xbox does. That means that if your TV doesn't understand a 480p signal, you'll probably just get a black screen. But I think the vast majority of TVs will be okay. If you're expecting any kind of enhanced image though, this won't give you that. As we've all become rather acquainted to 1080p or 4K now, going back to 480p can be a bit jarring. The big pixels and jagged lines do stick out, but overall it's a nice clean image. I'm very impressed with it, especially since it's just a standalone cable with no modding or power source required. If the game supports it, it will display a 60 frames per second signal just fine as well, like here in Dead or Alive 3 or Soul Calibur 2. But bear in mind, most games targeted 30 frames a second, and that's what you'll get out of the adapter as well. If the game is one of the few that can render in 720p, you'll get that delivered nicely, as you can see from this footage of Freedom Fighters. Again, the signal is clean and nicely bright. Overall, I'm very impressed. Does this come at some cost, say at the expense of some added latency? Well, here is my scientific testing method. I fired up Dead or Alive Ultimate direct to my monitor, so without a capture card, straight to its HDMI input, and set my phone to record in slow motion at 240 frames per second. I made sure the game is running at 60 frames a second to give it the best responsiveness possible, and timed the interval between pressing an attack button on the controller and the animation starting. It's approximate, but I can work out the total lag by counting the 240 frames a second frames. There are about 8 frames between pressing the button and seeing the animation start, so that means there's about 33 milliseconds of total lag in the system. I know my monitor has at least 5 milliseconds lag itself. That's what LG advertises, and I'm sure that's the best case scenario. So that means there's something like 25 milliseconds of lag between pressing the button and the picture being sent to the screen, or less if my monitor is actually slower than advertised. That's really good for the casual gamer, and anecdotally it feels just as responsive, if not more so, than back in the day. Honestly, if I was playing with a first-gen HD TV back in 2004, the response time of that alone was probably much worse. So in conclusion, I can't say for sure whether the Kaico introduces no lag or just a little bit, but it certainly doesn't introduce a lot, and it won't impact your gaming experience if you use it. Okay, let's take a look at a few of my favourite Xbox games and compare them side by side between the Kaico HDMI cable and what you would get out of the original composite connector. Okay, so let's start with Dead or Alive 3, and this was one of the launch titles for the Xbox alongside Halo, but it was definitely overshadowed by that game at the time, and I think there was a certain lack of attention on this as a result. It had this really cringe advert, She Kicks High, at the time as well, which was trying to sell it on its sex appeal, which was certainly one way of doing it, but that kind of is a bit unfair to it really, because it's actually a really good fighting game. It's 60 frames a second, really responsive. I love the move combinations for all the different characters. They're kind of just difficult enough. And I love the counter system, where you have this small window of opportunity to counter your opponent's attack and turn it into an attack back on them. Yeah, I think if you're going to get, several Xbox games, this should definitely be one of them. There's also Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate, which was a slightly sort of improved version of DOA 1 and 2. I've bought this game several times over on multiple different platforms now, because it's basically a very similar pattern to Dead or Alive 4, 5 and now 6. Yeah, I think this is a solid game. Or pick up DOA 2 Ultimate, that's probably slightly better if you were only going to get one of them. But yeah, Dead or Alive 3, it's good. If you've seen my channel, you'll know I am a games developer, and I was actually on the development team for Black. I was working at EA, and I'd just finished on Burnout Legends for PSP and PS2, and got put on secondment to Criterion. And I didn't quite know what game I was going to go and work on, but I had been following Black in games magazines at the time, so I was really excited to go and find out I'd be working on this game. And I did some of the UI, like the HUD and the front end and the kind of game flow. And yeah, I think this game is really cool and still stands up today. We were trying very hard to make it look amazing on the console generations at the time. And I think for the most part we succeeded. It's still fun to blast through it today. And another element that I think was really exciting was the kind of general destruction of the whole world and the physics. So, you know, if you shoot things enough, they blow up, and, you know, lots of parts of the environment are destructible. So, yeah, I mean, this is still a fun game today. I have some really fun memories of being back in the studio, you know, working with some of the other developers at the time. So, yeah, I look back on this one fondly, and I was really pleased to be a part of it. You should check it out. Okay, and Sudeki. I think this one flew under the radar for a lot of people. I really love RPGs, and I enjoyed playing my way through this one. It's certainly a little bit dated by today's standards. The camera controls are awful, and the combat controls are a little odd. I think things are kind of mapped in peculiar ways that are a little surprising to more standardized controls of today. But in general, there's a really fun game in there, albeit with some quite corny dialogue. And I'm really surprised this wasn't more popular at the time and didn't spawn a sequel or any other kind of spin-off, because the characters are kind of cool. So yeah, I think this game desperately needs a remaster. I'd love to see it brought into you know, a modern release on PC with better controls. Yeah, but I did enjoy it at the time. So yeah, if you want to get into a slightly more old school RPG, I recommend you give Sudeki a look.
Besides, I promised Elko I'd see his crystal tower light up.
Freedom Fighters. I actually completed this game on PC, but I picked it up for Xbox for this video, and it's one of the few games that supports 720p. So if you see in the comparison, you'll notice that the video from the Kaico adapter is much clearer, and that's because it can actually send a 720p progressive signal through the HDMI connection, whereas if you're using composite, you're limited to 480, probably 480i, because it wouldn't handle a progressive signal. So yeah, it looks way better if you have the right high definition connections, and it's a really good game, actually. I love the fact that you build a big squad and then go and kind of try and fight your way through a level together, and you can issue commands to all of your followers to get them to move into position or fall back. Yeah, it's really good gameplay and really fun to blast your way through. So yeah, if you want a nice looking game, definitely pick up Freedom Fighters.
People are starting to believe in you.
Breakdown. This is a really interesting game. Absolutely everything is done in first person. All of the fighting, so throwing punches or blocking, or shooting with guns, or even eating and drinking. Absolutely everything is done from Derek's point of view, and that makes it quite an innovative game, especially for the time. So that is also kind of the problem. It makes the fighting quite difficult because you can get disorientated quite quickly. The enemies can be quite brutal in the way that they attack, and it's difficult to move out of the way sometimes and just be aware of what's going on. So I would put the difficulty for this to easy as soon as you get started, and I think it should have shipped with that as the default difficulty, and I think they should also have added some features to make things a bit less punishing, so you know, you can't be hit when you're getting up or some other things like that, or some of the set pieces I think could have been a bit more kind to the player. But having said all that, the sci-fi story in this game is incredible, and it had me hooked right to the very end. I had to see what happened, and it kind of makes sense as you go through it as well, so you start having these revelations as you get towards the end of the game. That part of it is really, really cool. So if you love sci-fi, I think it's worth giving this one a look. And if you like first-person fighters, you'll probably like this too, but just be aware that the controls are difficult and take a bit of getting used to. So yeah, a very interesting and mixed game here, Breakdown. I do recommend you give it a look.
Is that your new power?
Soul Calibur 2, and I picked this one up purely for this video actually, because it's one of the few games that supports both 720p and 60 frames a second, but unfortunately, in that mode it becomes pillar boxed, so you get black bars on the left and right. Maybe the developers had to do that just to hit their frame rate target, so they were rendering to fewer pixels. But it looks fantastic. I think I still prefer the way Dead or Alive works, like the mechanics of the fighting and the interaction between the players. But this was recommended to me by some friends, and I think it's also a really good game. So if you like fighting games, you'll probably enjoy this. Yeah, and enjoy this footage. I think this really demonstrates the difference between a 480i signal and 720p. You can really see that it's worth getting some kind of high definition connection for your Xbox.
Fight! There.
I remember the day Halo 2 came out, and I remember getting it in the post and putting it in my Xbox for the first time. I was so excited, and I think a lot of Xbox owners were really excited for this game when it came out. And then the campaign was slightly disappointing. The bits with the Master Chief in it were fantastic, and then the bits with the Arbiter, well, you just played through the bits of the Arbiter so you could get back to the Master Chief levels. And then I don't want to spoil the ending, but it kind of is not very satisfying in Halo 2. So at the time, we had a long time to wait for Halo 3 to come out and kind of finish the story. But then it did, and Halo 3 was fantastic. So kind of mixed feelings about the campaign. It was really fun blasting through it, and yeah, nowadays maybe I'd recommend just playing the Master Chief only levels on the Master Chief Collection, which you can do on PC, but it's still a really solid game. And then there's the multiplayer element to it. And at the time, Halo 2 on Xbox Live was the coolest multiplayer thing I think I'd ever played. It was just so balanced and so much fun, and really clever how you could play as either a Spartan or a Covenant elite. You weren't forced into either character for the purpose of teams. And yeah, it was just so good on Xbox Live back when it came out. Everyone was playing it and talking about it and having a lot of fun. So Xbox Live is not running anymore for the original Xbox, so just be aware if you're picking this title up that you'll be getting it for its slightly mixed campaign, which at its best is brilliant. So yeah, that's Halo 2. You can play it nowadays on PC in the Master Chief Collection if you want a kind of more smooth and polished and up-to-date version. But this is still cool. If you're building an Xbox library of games, this kind of has to be in it, along with the original Halo. In conclusion, this is excellent value for money, with no modding required and priced at £35 or perhaps less if you go to their website. This is a very handy way of getting a clean HDMI signal from your Xbox. There are better and more expensive options available, such as the Chimeric Systems HDMI adapter, but they are like gold dust at the moment. Good luck even finding one available for sale. I think if you're obsessed with this console, there's a lot of potential for tinkering with the hardware. Control-Alt-Reese made an excellent video about sprucing up his old Crystal Xbox, not just adding an HDMI port soldered directly onto the board, but also replacing the noisy case fan and adding a larger drive for storage. But if, like me, you kind of want it to just work without breaking the bank, this is the sweet spot. I did toy with the idea of doing a case fan mod myself, and there are some handy kits which provide the 3D printed parts you'll need. But I think realistically, if I want to play an Xbox game now, I'm more likely to fire up an emulator and get internally scaled graphics which look even better. Here's an example of Dead or Alive 3 running at 4 times internal scale, so better than 1080p but not as good as 4K. And side by side with the Kaico from a real Xbox. Emulation for Xbox is in a pretty good state right now, with great compatibility, and you'll get handy features like save states. I think enough time has passed that we can officially call the OG Xbox a retro console now. As a result, you'll probably only have it set up under your TV if you have some kind of nostalgia for it. There are more convenient ways to play the games, honestly. There is something nice about playing a game on its original hardware, and if you're going to collect Xbox games professionally or just relive your childhood, I have some respect for you for that. I think of the Mega Drive as my childhood console. I have so many fun memories of playing Sonic or Streets of Rage, and the Xbox 360 is a fun device I had when I was an adult, so this kind of console sits in an awkward place between the two. I'm not going to pour my time and money into modding it any further, I think, but it is nice to know I can hook it up to my TV and check out my old games when I want to. What do you think? Is this handy for you, or do you have some other mods in mind? The same company makes some other interesting products. Shall I check out the SNES one next? Okay, that's my video. Please leave me a like if you found it useful, and you can help me out by subscribing to my channel as well. See you next time.